Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Target Iran, our topic. And with us we have Farideh Farhi, who is an Iran expert and an expert in American foreign policy to discuss this issue with us. So welcome, Farideh. You are also an affiliate faculty with the UH Mānoa Political Science Department and an independent scholar. You have written quite a bit on all kinds of topics regarding those issues. So now Iran is like, in the crosshairs, so to speak. And that is not for the first time, At least the past 10 years or so, it was like really in the crosshairs, although like the relationship between Iran and the United States and the West in general has been problematic since 1979, since the revolution of 1979. So could you tell us about those kinds of recent matters?
True. The Iranian-American relationship has been problematic since the 1979 revolution, but the turn for a difficult dynamic actually occurred during the Clinton administration in the 1990s, after the peace process had actually begun between the Palestinians and Israelis. Iran was deemed as an obstacle to U.S. intentions in the Middle East, as well as the Israeli and Saudi intentions. However, during the Obama administration, the latter part of the Obama administration, one of the main issues that has always been a concern regarding Iran, which was its nuclear program, and whether or not that program had actually had the potential to become weaponized, went through intense negotiations. And eventually, an agreement was reached, joint comprehensive plan of action, it's called, that effectively limited Iran's nuclear program in return for United States suspending some of its sanctions, as well as the Europeans getting rid of their sanctions. It was seen as an attempt to change the dynamic that existed between the United States and Iran. So while the nuclear issue was the negotiated issue, it was the first time since the revolution that a concerted effort was actually made to reframe the relationship between the United States and Iran in a different way through direct engagement. The result was quite successful. The Iranians did put a limit on their program, and the limit will be there for the next now 13 or 14 years. And the Obama administration suspended some of its sanctions, and the Europeans lifted their sanctions. So everybody thought that a dynamic, that acrimonious dynamic had made a turn. But with the Trump administration coming in, a lot of the people who have had animosity towards Iran for a long period of time, for a variety of reasons, and we can talk about it later, again put Iran on the map, as you say, on target. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that the dynamics in the Middle East are constantly evolving. For a short period of time, at least there deemed to be some sort of agreement that Iran and the United States needed to cooperate in order to fight against ISIS, the Islamic State, particularly in the case of Iraq. But as that situation was presumably resolved and the center of attention moved to Syria, where United States and Iran are on different sides. Iran, along with Russia, is on the side of the Syrian government, while United States, along with its allies, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and for a while Qatar, were on the side of the forces that were fighting Assad. Now that dynamic has come to the fore with the defeat, essential weakening at least of ISIS. So the question has become, what are Iran's intentions in Syria? And with Iran's influence in Iraq, the fact that Iran will also be influential in Syria, presumably, although Iran has always been influential in Syria, then the same people who made, the same countries who made an issue about Iran's nuclear program in the region, specifically Israel and Saudi Arabia, now they have turned their attention. They have forgotten about the complete focus and bombast that they engaged in relationship to Iran's nuclear program, now that the nuclear program has been limited, and have turned their attention to quote-unquote Iran's regional activities. And they identify that essentially as hegemonic activities, that is to say, an attempt to control the Middle East. In reality, that's far from the truth. What we are witnessing here is essentially a competition for control in the area.
Yeah. It's interesting, like, if we look at the map of Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Saudi Arabia down there in the south there, we see that, you know, it is a matter of neighbors, right? Syria, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Jordan also, like somewhere here. They are neighbors. But the thing is that, in fact, the United States comes how many miles away, you know? And of course, no one says that, in fact, the United States is in control of the, or has been in complete control of the Middle East, save for Iran, you know? But for Iran to like have good or neighborly relations with its neighbors, that is perceived as like something bad that Iran is trying to take over. Another thing in terms of Saudi Arabia has all kinds of influence in Syria, in Jordan, on the Gulf countries, all of them. You know, beginning with Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, you know, United Arab Emirates, it had a lot of influence on them. That is not seen as control by the Saudis over other independent Gulf states, you know. So it seems to me there is a problem here in terms of perception, and, you know, they are not looking at things in a neutral way. It's okay for people like Saudi Arabia to have control over, you know, those other countries, so long that Saudi Arabia is a satellite of the United States. But if someone wants to compete, as you say, for better relations and influence in the region as a regional power, then if it is not consonant with U.S. interests, then that is a no-no and shouldn't be done, and becomes a terrorist thing and creating instability in the region. So could you say more on that and give some examples, some recent examples, perhaps?
There are two interrelated issues here. One is the relationship between Iran and United States. As you pointed out, since the revolution, Iran is the only country in the Middle East that is not part of any kind of defense pact with extra regional powers. Every other country, you know, whether, you know, they're, you know, for example, Syria even, you know, it has a very, very close relationship with Russia, defensively, strategic relationship. While other countries like Saudi Arabia, like United Arab Emirates, like Israel, some of these countries actually have American bases in them. Others have very, very close relationships on defense issues. Iran is the only country that guarantees its own defense independently. So, and because of the nature of its revolution, has had a very, very critical approach to United States policies in the region. It wants United States out of the region, and it has said so. And for that reason, United States has always been has never had or has never figured out how to deal with Iran. Because when you think about it, United States hasn't, really doesn't know how to deal with countries in the Middle East unless it has some sort of a controlling stake with those countries, or, manage the system in such a way that, ultimately United States interests are served. Because it does not, it hasn't figured out how to deal with Iran. Then there is also the question of regional powers in the Middle East that have their own dynamic in relationship, and they have their own stakes in terms of creating a demon out of Iran because of their own internal politics as well as regional politics. So Saudi Arabia, which is going through a tremendous amount of change, generational change, political change, has a stake in, creating an enemy in order, and do it on a sectarian basis, in order to maintain its own control, its own domestic politics. So Israel is the same dynamic is at play. Israel has real issues, as we all know, in terms of occupation, but its constant reference to Iran and its mortal enemy is a way essentially to deflect attention from those kind of issues. At the same time, both of those countries felt extremely threatened by the Obama administration's gestures towards Iran. They saw the nuclear accord essentially as an opening that would improve the relationship with the United States. And by definition, from that point of view, it would undermine the kind of strategic links or strong links that the United States has had with Saudi Arabia and Israel. So the Obama, that is why the Obama administration was so despised in both Israel and Saudi Arabia, and in turn, the Trump administration is perceived as friendly, and as you know, in a very, very strange move, Trump went to Saudi Arabia in his first foreign trip and essentially gave complete support. Now, ironically, that has created a situation for Saudi Arabia that it has ended up making Saudi Arabia overreach. So Saudi Arabia's American support, Trump's support for Saudi Arabian policy has led to a humanitarian disaster, or the continuation of a humanitarian disaster in Yemen. Because Saudi Arabia invaded or attacked Yemen. And then it also led to Saudi Arabia cutting off relationship with Qatar and effectively calling Qatar a terrorist sponsor of, or a state sponsor of terrorism. In both cases, the overreach, it was based on the assumption that they would get full support from the United States, but the United States bureaucracy did not respond the same way that the Trump administration wanted. So the State Department and Defense Department, United States has a military bases in Qatar, disagreed. So in both cases, Saudi Arabia has been pushed back. And then finally, in the latest move in relationship to Lebanon, where the Saudis effectively took the prime minister of Lebanon hostage and forced him to resign from his post from Saudi Arabia, again, based on the assumption that they would get support from the Trump administration. And they probably did, but they did not get support from the State Department. And therefore, eventually, that has also was seen as an overreach that did not go anywhere. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that there is this historic dynamic that exists between Iran and United States, this bilateral animosity that dates back to the revolution. And then there is these regional dynamics as well that has to do with the relationship other countries have in the region with the United States and the fears that they have that as the United States potentially might withdraw from the Middle East and direct its attention to, for instance, Asia because of China's rise, that because of that, they are, they would not get the kind of support that they have gotten in the past to pursue the policies that they used to pursue in the region as well as domestically. And that fear has generated this intense effort to again demonize Iran after the nuclear agreement.
Yeah, that's a lot of dynamics right there. The thing, it seems to me, you see like the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and the State of Israel and Palestine. And this has to do with a lot of things you mentioned, like the question of Iran nuclear and all of that. But if we put it also, as you have suggested as well, in terms of the inter-rivalry among the regional states, and in the context of those respective regional states having relations with outside forces, extra-regional forces, like for instance, Saudi Arabia, United States, Turkey, United States, and so forth. If we put all of that, we can see that Israel, in terms of rivalry with other countries, wants to seize in Iran a threat, because Iran is not going to allow it to have control over Iranian policy, and not going to allow it to have control over Iraq, because then Israel would be right next to Iraq. And this is one thing as regards to the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, in the north of Iraq, bordering Turkey. If Israel is there, then it would be a direct threat to Iran. So, therefore, it seems to me that this kind of, I'm kind of trying to detail the rivalry even more to show how Saudi Arabia and Israel are coming together to try and counter Iran and put it in the crosshairs. And they've been, for the longest time, as you know, egging the United States to, attack Iran. Attack Iran. And that is, and Netanyahu said, if the U.S. doesn't attack Iran, we will attack Iran.
Exactly. And Secretary Kerry just pointed out that during the negotiations, it was the Saudis and the Israelis that were constantly pushing the United States to attack Iran. And that kind of dynamic is something that creates all sorts of difficulties for United States. You pointed out, there's so many layers of relationships and conflicts in the Middle East that at this point that you can no longer come up with a straight narrative about what's going to happen or any move that any one particularly country makes. For example, you just mentioned the Kurdish regional government, which exists in northern part of Iraq. And just recently there was a referendum that essentially called for autonomy or independence, actually, of that from the Iraqi government. It was very clear that the countries that were supporting that referendum, essentially the main country that was supporting that referendum was the government of Israel. Israel is present in northern Iraq. It does see itself as a lever, that place as a lever against Iran. However, it really doesn't have the kind of means to exert that kind of influence in a coherent fashion. So in the case of the referendum, again, there was a miscalculation on the part of the KRG, Kurdish Regional Government's leader, as well as the Israeli government, thinking that the United States government would support the referendum. Well, the United States government did not support the referendum because the United States also has another stake, another client in the region at this time, which is the Iraqi government itself. And therefore, the United States, Iran, and Turkey, as well as, of course, the Iraqi government, were placed in a similar position in relationship to KRG. And it turned out to be a disaster for the Kurdish regional government because the Iraqi government, with the help of United States advisors as well as the Iranian advisors, ended up going back and taking over the area that the Kurdish regional government had taken over when
in the region
in the absence of ISIS, yes. It took back, and the regional government essentially ended up paying dearly for a decision that was egged on by the Israelis that were present in that area. Their expectations, like the Saudi expectation, when, they kept, they took Mr. Hariri and forced him to resign, was for the United States government to give support. Mr. Trump has given verbal support, but the United States bureaucracy, given the longer standing interests that exist with other players in the region, did not. And so both of these countries, both of these leadership saw, had to pay for their own overreach.
Like in the map, the area of Kirkuk was the flashpoint
exactly.
right after the referendum of the Kurdish that the Kurdish regional government ran. And they had to vacate.
Absolutely, and Kirkuk is a big, the reason it's such a big deal. The Kurdish regional, the majority is not Kurdish, but the regional government came and took over after effectively in place of ISIS because of its oil resources. It actually made a deal with the Russian government, but eventually, now the Iraqi government has come in and has taken over because it's an important resource-based region. And so the referendum, which people had argued was merely a bargaining chip for the Kurdish regional government to increase its influence in relationship to the Iraqi government, ended up harming the regional government in important ways.
More detail on this, I just want to show on the map. For instance, the Kurdish regional government its capital is Erbil, right here. And but people might think that all the Kurds are together and love one another, etc. That's not true, because in Suleimaniya there is the base for another political party, Kurdish party, that is in conflict with the Erbil government and the Barazani, Masoud al-Barazani, the head, who's the president of the KRG, whose term has ended a while back.
And until the referendum, or a few weeks before the referendum, he had actually disbanded the parliament too.
Right. So
and he's highly corrupt.
And in fact, the people, the Kurdish party, and Kurdish Democratic Party in Kurdish Democratic Union Party in Sulaymaniyah, which opposes the Erbil government, Masoud Barzani, were in Kirkuk and were ready to fight the other Kurds as well. You know, so I mean, there you go. So it was a major disaster for the Erbil government, the KRG, egged on by the Israelis, of course, and the Saudis. So here is another thing that, in fact, Iran had been able, not only Iran, but all the coalition that you're talking about, had been able to, you know, get rid of Israeli influence, Saudi influence. From Iraq as a whole, there is still American influence in Baghdad through the Haidar al-Abadi, who is the prime minister of Iraq. But also he has a lot of pressures on him. So it's not like he doesn't move a la American, so to speak, but he has to balance all kinds of things together. So that is another defeat for the Saudis and the Israelis. Just as you mentioned, the question of the Lebanese prime minister, you know, and that kind of like fizzled out because now I was reading something in Arabic about the president of Lebanon saying that, in fact, Hariri is not going to resign. You know, this is the latest, you know, just like 2 hours ago.
Yeah, and Hariri, this is really interesting because Hariri, you know, the explanation that Hariri gave for his resignation essentially was that Hezbollah, a political party that is also armed in Lebanon, was engaged in regional activities because Hezbollah has been involved in fighting against anti-Assad forces in Syria. So he pointed to Hezbollah's regional ambitions. And now that he has come back, he essentially says that he is still, you know, will only remain prime minister if Hezbollah gives up its regional ambitions. Well, the funny part of all this is that the war in Syria is effectively over. So Syria really, I mean, Hezbollah really is not going to be in Syria for a long period of time. So it really, you know, so the effort on the part of the Saudis to actually reduce the influence of Hezbollah in Lebanese domestic politics has not worked.
No.
And Hariri will remain president.
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, I'm sorry. And there's going to be an election in Lebanon next year. Most people agree that now Hezbollah may actually do even better in relationship to in the election. So domestically, the point I'm trying to make is that Hariri did not make the argument that I'm not going to hang around if Hezbollah continues to be influential inside Lebanon. He has made the argument, I'm not going to resign, or I'm going to resign only if Hezbollah continues its regional activity. And he's doing it exactly at the same time when there is a good chance that Hezbollah's regional activities are being reduced anyways.
Yeah.
Because of the changes on the ground in Syria.
Yeah, that's a good point, but I want to show a map of Lebanon and Syria. By the way, historically, Lebanon was part of Syria.
Yeah.
Okay, so the French in 1923, in their wisdom, they created the state of Greater Lebanon, you know. Because before,
on sectarian basis.
Yeah, on sectarian basis, because Lebanon, the Lebanese mountain, or what we call in Lebanon, Mount Lebanon, was a region created for protection of the Christians from the Muslims. You know, that's like through intervention and power play by Western powers. I mean, we don't need to discuss that. And then in 1923, all these areas were carved out of Syria, and the French made Greater Lebanon, state of Greater Lebanon. But the thing is that, Syria and Iraq, were fighting Daesh, which is ISIS, in other words. But in Arabic, we call it Daesh. Syria and Iraq were both fighting Daesh. And Daesh was on the borders and inside Lebanon, in this area right here, just like this, and there were bombings in Beirut by Daesh forces in Beirut, several bombings, killed a lot of people, and so the war in Syria, that the Saudis were very influential in supporting those terrorists in Syria, the Turks that were supporting those terrorists in Syria, and also the Qataris were very influential in there, and the United Arab Emirates, and of course a lot of Western powers, and Israel had like its operatives also in Syria operating with those terrorists. They were a threat to Lebanon, and not only to Lebanon, to the entire region, So the Hezbollah, the war started, March 15th, 2011. Hezbollah went into Syria to fight the terrorists, otherwise they will come in, especially when there were terrorists already entrenched in Lebanese territory. So they went to fight the terrorists there before they come over and take over Beirut. So that was the Saudi plan, to take over the entire region and divide Syria, divide Lebanon, because there are forces in Lebanon that want to divide Lebanon, and Lebanon is like as huge as the state of Connecticut. You know how small it is. That's all. So Hezbollah was playing a role to defend Lebanon and defend the region, along with other forces, from those terrorists that were supported by the Saudis, the Israelis, and the rest of it. And we can see also how Israelis on the Syrian border and in areas of Syria now occupied by Israel, how the Israelis have been supporting terrorists of Al-Qaeda and Daesh in that area.
But, but in this latest dynamic, there was also an argument made, because the Saudis, having made such a disaster in terms of their attacks against Yemen, they really have not shown any capabilities in terms of their military prowess, that what they were trying to do in calling Hariri into Saudi Arabia and pulling him out of this government that is effectively a coalition government, was to sort of expose the Lebanese government as a sectarian, Hezbollah-controlled government, therefore easing the way for the Israelis to attack Lebanon, because there have been talks for several years that Israel is bound to attack Lebanon again. And the argument was made, and in fact, former United States ambassador to Israel wrote a piece for Haaretz, essentially saying to the Israelis, don't fall for this trap, that the Saudis want you to do their dirty work, and don't do it. Whether or not the Saudis had hoped that the Israelis would pick up on this and attack, in any case, the effort was undercut by both the president of Lebanon, Mr. Aoun, who essentially said, I'm not going to accept Hariri's resignation, as well as the head of Hezbollah, who came out, Mr. Nasrallah, who came and said, we consider Mr. Hariri a hostage and we will not You know, he's a Lebanese and he should come back. And, you know, so the play, you know, politically was undermined. Whether or not this was something that was intended to bring the Israelis in, I don't know, but at least that's what it was discussed, and it didn't work for so far.
So it's interesting, like the Saudis and the Israelis. I mean, I don't want to mention other Western powers, but the Saudis and the Israelis have failed in Iraq, not only with the Kurdish regional government, which we talked about, but failed in employing Daesh inside Iraq because all these territories that were taken by Daesh were retaken by the Iraqi government. So that's one. Their operation in Syria has failed because the terrorists are being defeated. In terms of trying to persuade Israel by saying to attack Lebanon, by saying we will fund your war, that didn't work out. And then the other thing in Yemen, I want to show on the map in Yemen, for instance here, Saudi Arabia and Yemen, there's a historical relationship between them. And in fact, in terms of Yemen, so it's been always under Saudi influence. But at one point, the Yemenis said, especially after 2011, we don't want to be under the influence. We want to be really independent. So that was a no-no already. And therefore, in 2015, you know, the Saudis had attacked Yemen. They accused Yemen of doing terrorist activities and like Iranian intervention in Yemen and all of that kind of stuff. That nothing of the sort was happening. In fact,
I think you should show the map again. Show the map again, and you can see how far Yemen is from Iran.
Iran is Iran is here.
And you know, in terms of Iran's national security doctrine, Yemen does not play any role in national security doctrine, Iran's national security doctrine. Now, with the Saudis making missteps, the Iranians, you know, don't mind being opportunistic and essentially claiming things that suggest Iran, you know, has more power than it has. It's part and parcel of its power projection. But so far, really, nothing has been shown, or barely anything has been shown, that suggests that Iran is directly involved in Yemen. At the same time, the Saudis, along with their partners, you know, United Arab Emirates, but also the support from United States and Britain, what they have done is to impose very, very severe embargo on Yemen, closing ports, closing airports, essentially creating a humanitarian crisis that has engulfed at least 7 million people so far. The United Nations has just warned another 3.5 million. I mean, and remember, population of Yemen is about 26 million. Yemen is almost in population-wise, almost as large as Saudi Arabia itself. But it's the poorest of all countries in the region with per capita income of less than $1,000. And here you have a Saudi government with per capita income of over $20,000, but because it does not have the capability to send armed forces, you know, boots on the ground into Yemen, what it has done is that it has randomly and viciously bombed the country in ways that have created this humanitarian crisis. And United States has given Saudi Arabia support. Not only it has given it support, but because in the last year, since the Trump administrations, you know, it has actually encouraged the dynamic of this humanitarian disaster. And, you know, with no end in sight, someone wrote today a very interesting commentary because, you know, For those of us who are old enough, we remember that in the 1960s, it was Nasser's Egypt. It was Egypt under Nasser that, invaded, if you remember, Yemen to try to bring it under the guise of the United Arab Republic. And that was a total failure because Yemen is a very, very difficult place to conquer.
Yeah.
You can destroy, but you can conquer it. But someone pointed out that in the process of attacking Yemen, Nasser actually revealed its own military weaknesses that then it was capitalized on very handsomely by the Israelis in the 1968 war. And the same dynamic is at play in relationship to Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure if anybody is going to capitalize on Saudi military's weaknesses, but certainly the fact that they have not been able to do anything and finish the war suggests quite a bit of weaknesses.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like back to the map, I want to show there are 3 provinces that are Saudi provinces currently, but they were carved out of Yemen. Actually, this is Jizan, Asir, and Najran. And it's interesting, the failure of the Saudi campaign in Yemen shows that, in fact, in those 3, or at least Jizan and Najran, Yemeni troops have gone in there and defeated Saudi troops right there, yeah? So, but the other thing is that the people who are really involved in the Yemen and supporting, the Saudi invasion and the Saudi air campaign against Yemen is actually Israel and the United States. In Djibouti, Israel has a base there, and the U.S. has a base, and of course the French are there as well, because Djibouti was before a French colony. And so these are the ones who are helping, wipe out a lot of Yemeni civilians on a daily basis. In fact, cholera, close to 1 million people had cholera, and a lot of people die every 10 minutes. United Nations, UNICEF. Every 10 minutes, one Yemeni child dies because of the cholera epidemic. And this has to do with the embargo, the blockade, and the sanctions, and all of that.
Cholera is totally treatable. Yeah. I do want to point out, since the program is about targeting Iran, that the latest increase in rhetoric against Iran by the Saudis came when the Houthis were able to send a missile to Riyadh,
the capital of Saudi Arabia.
Capital of Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis claim that missile was essentially Iranian-made, and suggested that it was actually sent to Riyadh on the direction of Iran. So that created the context for the enhanced rhetoric and opened the way for the calling of Mr. Hariri into Saudi Arabia to force his resignation.
I wanted to say something on that. In fact, the missile was after the Hariri resignation.
Was it?
Yeah. So that is an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So it didn't have, but what it was is like Iranian intervention, in Yemen that Iran is accused of, and that creates more pressure on Iran, and it gets targeted because it's doing all these kinds of things. But the other thing is that the Yemen disaster for the Yemeni people, but the political disaster for Mohammed bin Salman, who's the heir to the throne, and effectively he's the king now, he's running the show because he's like defense minister and a lot of other things. And his campaign has failed, so this is an important thing. His campaign has failed, and now he's trying to get out of this. And that's what you were talking about, like help us in Lebanon, we can, so help us in Yemen, we'll help you in Lebanon. But that card failed in Lebanon because it was like, basically the teeth were taken out of that kind of move with Hariri, the Saudi move with Hariri, etc. And all these debacles for the Saudis, the Israelis together, have really, rather than ease the pressure on Iran, now Iran is being more accused even more, but doing all these things so that they want to still try and do something to attack it or weaken it or, blackmail it.
The dynamic is like this, okay? Just to give an example. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates cut off relationship with Qatar. They actually impose an economic embargo on Qatar and accuse it of supporting terrorism. Most people agree it's because of Al Jazeera and the fact that Qatar has some sort of an independent foreign policy. Anyway, Qatar did not necessarily have a great relationship with Iran, but it did have a relationship with Iran because they have a joint gas field
and
that they have to eventually work together, in terms of how to do it. Now, the end result of the embargo has been that Qatar and Iranian relationships have improved economically because the Iranians have begun to help the, send stuff into Qatar to go around the embargo. Of course, the side effect of this, another side to the story was that Turkey actually sent troops into Qatar. Troops into Qatar. But the point is that the Saudi move and United Arab Emirates move, instead of undermining and cornering Qatar, it has improved the relationship between Qatar and Iran. And now Iran gets accused of trying to project power and control Qatar. Now, Iran was sitting, is the same dynamic that has happened, throughout the neighborhood. So you have these missteps that the Iranians enter and try to fill the void because they're, they are a country that have been surrounded or are surrounded by many, many American military bases. They have been contained economically through a very, very intense sanctions regime. So they're always trying to figure out a way to get out of that. Economic isolation, political isolation, and military threats. So when other countries engage in missteps, the Iranians, opportunistically try to benefit from that. And then they get accused of being a hegemonic power in the region without reference to the kind of moves that their rivals are engaged in the region.
I want to show on the map what you have mentioned and put it in perspective. This is Qatar, right? The oil gas field is right here. So that's one thing. Now, Qatar is accused by Saudis because they want to get out of the accusation by the West of them supporting terrorism, just like the Obama administration was talking about, right? And Kerry, the State Department secretary under Obama. So the Saudis accuse the Qataris of supporting terrorism. And it's interesting, the previous foreign minister of Qatar said, well, that was an agreement that we all support those guys to fight in Syria against the Assad regime and the Syrian state. So he accused also the Saudis, of agreement between the Qataris, the Saudis, United Arab Emirates, and the Jordanians, etc., and the Turks to support terrorism inside Syria to topple. The Israelis were in on it too, but to topple the Syrian state and the Assad regime by implication. And so that is an interesting dynamic that they are accusing each other. But here, when there was embargo and a blockade, all kinds of stuff that Saudi had against Qatar, so what did the Iranians do? The Iranians opened their airspace to Qatar, so to have like access to the outside world, because otherwise, they cannot do it. Like United Arab Emirates was against them and wouldn't open its borders and cannot go anywhere except this way, And so they took advantage of that.
Yeah, that means that the Iranian airports will get paid for the flight over. So the counterproductiveness of the Saudi move. But the point is that the Saudis are the ones, or the United Arab Emirates are the ones that are engaging in this kind of moves. And then when other people benefit, or when their actions ended up being counterproductive, they blame Iran for their own stupid and counterproductive policies. And the reality is that the Trump administration is very much, for reasons that to me are not yet clear, are very much supportive of this kind of dynamic. As you know, just recently, again, because the program is targeted on Iran, the head of CIA, Mike Pompeo, released thousands of documents, and through an organization whose record is very clear. They have agitated for sanctioning Iran and containing Iran, even attacking Iran for years. Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, that presumably shows that Iran and Al-Qaeda are in cahoots. Again, fortunately, because these kind of lies have been repeated so many times and have been the reason for invasions and bad policies in the past, immediately people pointed out to the irony of the whole situation, which foundation released the documents, why the CIA is doing it at the same time. And then people combed through the documents, and it was shown that the documents were released selectively, or parts of it, while in reality the Iranian government was trying to figure out what to do when United States had invaded Afghanistan, and many Al-Qaeda folks, because of United States attack, were running around and going to different neighboring countries. And Iran had arrested some people, and in fact at one point had suggested to United States that there would be a swap between the Al-Qaeda folks that they had captured and were imprisoned in Iran, and the opposition forces in Iraq that the United States was supporting, but that didn't work out.
Right. The other thing I want to show, in terms of target Iran, we talked about Israel being in the Kurdish region, on the map, for instance, in terms of Iraq, the Kurdish region, Israel was there. But if we go to this other map here, Israel is also in Azerbaijan, you see? So you're going to have like a pincer movement against that with the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates on the other side of the Gulf, etc. So this would be a dangerous situation for Iran.
I do want to point something out, that because Iran is a multi-ethnic society, and has a long history of existence as a multi-ethnic society. Surrounding Iran are all sorts of different ethnic groups. And, in the western part, you have the Kurdish population. In the northern part, you have the Azeri population with close link to Azerbaijan. In southeastern part of Iran, you have the Baluchi population, close connection to Balochistan in Pakistan.
yeah.
And in all those
That's right
areas,
here, yeah.
in all these areas, you actually do see agitation. Not only, in support of these ethnic movements, the more radical elements that are secessionist by Israelis, but also by the Saudis as well. So that has happened. There is also this reality that, Iran is a well-established nation state after so many years. And none of these activities has actually worked in terms of creating the kind of agitation that they had hoped for. However, it has domestic consequences in the sense that the Iranian government uses these kind of threats to make an argument, to crush dissent inside Iran.
Right, they use that.
They use that kind of, so any kind of, not necessarily, secessionist movements, but any kind of complaints, for example, about lack of amenities in different parts of Iran, it's very easily turned into a charge that you are engaged in action against the central state. So, when people say that these kind of foreign threats end up strengthening the hardliners inside Iran, what they are actually saying is that these kind of external threats, whether it comes in the form of U.S. general threat or also, more regional ethnic-based threats, they actually end up helping the securitization of the Iranian state.
And one thing, I mean, you mentioned that also like the question of Israel and its occupation of Palestine. That's an interesting thing. So it wants to cover that, one. And the other hand, on the other hand, also it wants to do have everybody recognize it as the Jewish state. So if you begin to divide all these countries, including Iran, along ethnic and religious lines, therefore they'll become a Sunni state, a Shia state, etc. And why not a Jewish state? Everybody would recognize it as such. And that would be a dangerous thing because Israel would then have more control over territory because it doesn't have borders, Israel, yet. It's an expanding project. And so that would be counter to a lot of states in the region, counter to Syrian interests of unifying and keep Syria unified, Iraq being kept unified, Iran, and so forth, even Turkey. And that's why now we have a problem with Turkey and the United States, etc., with the question of the Kurds, because southeast Turkey is actually, they have at least 14, 15 million Kurds in Turkey out of 80 million people, which is a lot of people, So if southeast Turkey is divided, taken away and have a Kurdish state there, then Turkey would be also pulverized, shall we say.
That's why Turkey opposes sort of a Turkish, a Kurdish state or autonomous state in Syria.
Yeah. Anyway, that's right. And the Turks are also in Syria. But basically, we have a few more seconds. Any quick thing?
Not really. It's just that the situation in the Middle East, in this Persian Gulf area, is extremely fluid. And, there are people that are agitating for war and instability. As citizens, we really need to be very careful to make sure that doesn't happen.
Well, thank you very much for coming. And aloha and mahalo nui loa for watching. And see you 2018. Aloha, Merry Christmas. Bye.